The cold came down from the mountain like a judgment. It settled in the hollows and clung to the undersides of pine boughs, a damp weight that promised an early winter. Rowan felt it in the knuckles of his right hand, a dull ache that tracked the weather better than any forecast. He flexed his fingers around the worn leather of the leash, the movement automatic, a conversation with the past. The air smelled of wet earth and rust, the metallic tang of decay that was the forest's secret language. It was a smell he knew too well, a scent that lived behind his teeth. He walked the trail not for pleasure but for maintenance, a self-imposed duty that gave shape to the silence of his days. The forest wasn't a sanctuary, it was a perimeter. He moved through it with the economy of a man who had learned that wasted motion was a liability. His olive field jacket, worn soft at the elbows, made no sound against the brush. His boots, scuffed and trusted, landed heel to toe, a rhythm of quiet patrol that had been drilled into his bones until it became a part of his breathing. He scanned the tree line, his gaze never resting, cataloging the breaks in pattern, the subtle disturbances that meant something had passed. It was a habit he couldn't break, a vigilance that had followed him home from deserts and mountains half a world away. Ahead of him, Sargent moved with the same quiet purpose. The dog was not a pet. He was a partner, a four-legged echo of Rowan's own training. A German shepherd, black and tan, with the lean, functional muscle of a creature built for work. His coat absorbed the flat gray light. His paws made only the softest indentations in the damp soil. He didn't sniff aimlessly or bound ahead. He cleared the path, his head held steady, his dark, intelligent eyes taking inventory of the world. They communicated in the spaces between words, a shift in weight, the subtle tension on the leash, the angle of an ear. It was a language of shared experience, more reliable than any spoken tongue. Rowan trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. His own had failed before. The disruption began as a stillness. Sargent, who was 10 paces ahead, simply stopped. It wasn't the alert posture of a deer sighting or the low stance of a predator's scent. It was a full stop, a rootedness, as if he'd become part of the landscape. His head was raised, nostrils testing a current of air Rowan couldn't feel. The muscles in his shoulders were taut. Rowan halted instantly, his hand tightening on the leash. The silence of the forest deepened, suddenly filled with unspoken questions. The wind whispered through the high pines, a sound like distant static. "What is it, boy?" Rowan's voice was a low rumble, swallowed by the vastness. Sargent didn't look back. His focus was absolute, fixed on something unseen upwind. He took a hesitant step, then another, pulling Rowan off the marked trail and into the dense undergrowth. The dog's refusal to continue their routine was more alarming than a bark or a growl. It was a signal, a deviation from a decade of ingrained procedure. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, fundamentally, out of place. Rowan followed, the familiar ache in his knuckles sharpening into a needle of apprehension. The smell of rust was stronger here, mingling with the faint, cloying sweetness of rot and something else, something chemical and old. They moved through a stand of skeletal aspens, their white bark peeling like sunburnt skin. The ground grew soft and spongy underfoot, a carpet of moss hiding a history of mud and decay. Sargent led him on, his body low, a dark shape against the muted greens and browns. He wasn't tracking an animal. This was different. This was a search. The dog was working, falling back into a protocol that Rowan recognized with a cold knot in his stomach. It was the pattern for locating human remains, or what was left of them. The air grew colder, heavy with the damp breath of the earth. The wreck was a wound in the side of the hill, a jagged tear of metal and shattered plexiglass half swallowed by blackberry thorns in time. It was the fuselage of a small Cessna, its silver skin oxidized to a leprous gray, streaked with rust that bled down its rivets like old tears. The mountain wore its silence like a uniform, and this intrusion was a stain upon it. The plane had been here for years, its presence slowly erased by the patient, relentless growth of the forest. Rowan felt the hair on his arms stand up. This was a place of violent ending, a tomb sealed by foliage. Sargent sat at a respectful distance, his posture a quiet signal of discovery. He looked from the wreck to Rowan, his gaze steady, expectant. He had done his job. Now it was Rowan's turn. Rowan unclipped the leash, and the dog remained where he was, a silent, disciplined sentinel. Rowan approached the wreckage slowly, his senses on high alert. The smell was stronger now, rust, damp earth, and the faint, almost imperceptible scent of old fuel. He circled the fuselage, his boots crunching on fallen leaves and broken glass. The wings were sheared off, the engine a mangled block of corrosion pushed deep into the soil. It watched them the way old debts watch from across a room. He peered inside through a shattered window. The cockpit was a mess of decaying upholstery and twisted controls. But it was the cabin that held his attention. It wasn't just a crash site. Someone had lived here. Blankets, rotten and heavy with moisture, were folded neatly on one of the seats. A small stack of canned goods, their labels long since dissolved into pulp, sat in a rusted crate. A length of parachute cord was strung from one side of the cabin to the other, a makeshift clothesline. Someone had survived. Someone had waited. Sergeant whined, a low, guttural sound of distress. It was a noise Rowan had not heard in years. He turned. The dog had moved from his position and was now sniffing intently at the base of the trailhead marker, a simple wooden post that marked the beginning of the path they had just abandoned. He pawed at the dirt, his movements precise, insistent. Not digging wildly, but excavating. Rowan walked back, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He knelt beside the dog, the cold of the ground seeping through his jeans. Beneath a thin layer of soil and pine needles was a flat stone. It was out of place, its edges too square, its surface too smooth for the surrounding terrain. Rowan worked his fingers under the edge and lifted. Underneath was a dark void. He reached in, his fingers brushing against something solid and cold. It was a metal box, an old military-style ammunition can, its green paint flaking away to reveal the rust underneath. He lifted it out. It was heavy, solid. The latch was sealed with a thick layer of wax. Scratched into the lid, etched with a knife or a sharp rock, were 5 words that stopped the air in his lungs. For the one who stayed. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, coiled in his gut. This wasn't a random discovery. This was a message, a testament. He worked his pocket knife under the wax seal, his hand steady despite the tremor that ran through him. The latch gave way with a groan of protest. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried moss, were 3 objects. A small leather-bound journal, a handheld digital voice recorder, and a single tarnished silver dog tag on a broken chain. He didn't need to read the name, he already knew. The scent of rust and damp earth faded, replaced by the smell of diesel fumes, hot dust, and cordite. The muted gray light of the forest dissolved into the blinding white sun of Kandahar. The whisper of the wind became the whine of a Blackhawk's turbines. The door. Just a door. Hesitation, a fraction of a second, a flicker of doubt, a gut feeling that screamed, wrong. But procedure was procedure. He should have breached. He should have gone in. Instead, he'd paused, signaled for a final check. Elias had given him a look, not of impatience, but of trust. He'd clapped Rowan on the shoulder, a solid, grounding weight. "I got it," he'd said, his voice calm in the comms, and he'd gone through the door alone. The world came rushing back in a wave of nausea. The forest floor tilted beneath him. He was on his knees, the open box in his hands, the dog tag cold against his palm. He read the name stamped into the metal, the letters worn but clear. Vance, Elias M. He felt a pressure against his side, warm and solid. Sergeant had moved to his side, leaning his weight against Rowan's body, a silent anchor in the swirling vortex of memory. The dog's breath was warm on his hand. Recognition. Not a growl, not a bark. A profound and terrible recognition. He didn't go back for the body. There was nothing left to go back for. He closed the box. The click of the latch was unnaturally loud in the sudden, ringing silence. He had to report this. He had to follow the rules. But a part of him, a dark, grieving part, wanted to bury the box again and walk away, to leave the ghost of Elias Vance to the patient silence of the mountain. But the dog was looking at him, his dark eyes filled with an expectation that felt like a judgment. Sergeant had been Elias's dog first, he remembered. And Rowan knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not walk away. He had already done that once. The weight of the box was the weight of a promise he had failed to keep. The connection was no longer a ghost. It was a physical thing, a cold, rusted piece of metal in his hands. Elias Vance, his handler, his mentor, the man who had taught him how to read the silence, how to trust the dog, how to stay. And the man Rowan had watched die because he had hesitated. The survivor's guilt he carried like a second skeleton suddenly had a voice, and it was whispering from the pages of the journal in the box. He stood up, his knees cracking in protest. He clipped the leash back onto Sargent's collar. The dog looked up at him, then at the box, and then back at him. There was no confusion in his gaze, only a shared history, a shared loss that transcended the boundary between man and animal. Sargent had been there too. He had been waiting outside that door. He had heard the blast. He had felt the world come apart. The dog remembered. He had been guarding this place, this memory, waiting for Rowan to finally find it. "Okay, Sarge," Rowan said, his voice rough. "Okay." He made the call on his satellite phone, his words clipped, professional, giving away none of the storm raging inside him. He reported a downed aircraft, potential human remains, a discovery requiring official investigation. He gave the coordinates. He didn't mention the box. Not yet. That was a piece of the truth he needed to hold on to, just for a little while longer. The dispatcher's voice was a tinny, impersonal buzz in his ear, a voice from a world that had not yet been fractured by this discovery. The quiet companion appeared not with a siren, but with the familiar, gravelly crunch of tires on the dirt access road. Ben's old blue Ford truck was a fixture in the small town, as reliable and understated as the man who drove it. He ran the local auto shop, a place that smelled of grease and coffee and unspoken truths. He was a fellow veteran, a man who understood the language of silence. He got out of the truck and didn't say a word at first, just took in the scene. The yellow tape Rowan had strung up, the grim set of Rowan's jaw, the rigid posture of the dog. Ben carried 2 thermoses. He handed one to Rowan without being asked. "Coffee," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an offering. He knew Rowan's preference. Black, strong, hot enough to burn. It was a small thing, a remembered detail, but it felt like a lifeline. Ben looked at the fuselage, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Been here a while." "A long while," Rowan agreed, the steam from the coffee warming his cold hands. "You okay?" Ben's eyes, a faded blue that had seen too much, met his. The question was quiet, but it carried weight. He wasn't asking about physical harm. He was asking about the things that didn't leave visible scars. Rowan just nodded, unable to form the words. Ben seemed to understand. He didn't push. He just stood there beside him, a solid presence against the encroaching chill of the evening. He looked from Rowan's face to the dog, who sat patiently at Rowan's heel. Then he looked back at Rowan, and for a beat longer than necessary, his gaze held. It was a look of profound, unspoken understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the shared weight they both carried. In that brief moment, Rowan felt a flicker of warmth in his chest, an ache he couldn't name and didn't dare examine. It was just Ben, being there. It was enough. "I heard the call on the scanner," Ben said, breaking the silence. "Figured you could use a hand securing the site until the feds get here." He nodded toward the back of his truck, where a set of portable floodlights and extra lengths of rope were visible. He had come prepared. He always did. The official presence arrived in the form of a dark green Forest Service vehicle. A woman in her late 30s stepped out, her movements efficient and confident. Ranger Maya Singh. She was competent, grounded, and had a reputation for being thorough to a fault. She nodded at Rowan, her expression professional, but her eyes held a flicker of concern. "Rowan," she said, "talk to me." He gave her the facts, sticking to the official narrative. The routine patrol, the dog's alert, the discovery of the wreck. He watched her as she worked, her process methodical and precise. She took photos, made notes, her focus absolute. She treated Sargent with a professional respect that Rowan appreciated, addressing the dog as if he were a fellow officer. "Good work, Sargent," she said, her voice low and calm. The dog's tail gave a single, almost imperceptible thump against the ground. While Maya documented the exterior, Rowan finally told her about the box. He led her back to the trailhead marker and showed her the empty space beneath the stone. He handed her the ammunition can. She took it carefully, her eyes scanning the scratched words on the lid. She opened it, her expression unreadable as she examined the contents. She picked up the dog tag, holding it in her gloved hand. "Elias Vance," she said, reading the name aloud. The name hung in the cold air, a ghost given form. He was a former smoke jumper, went missing about 5 years ago on a solo flight. They searched for months, found nothing. She looked at Rowan. "You knew him?" "He was my handler," Rowan said. The words felt like stones in his mouth. "In the Navy." Maya's professional demeanor softened for a fraction of a second. She placed the tag gently back in the box and closed the lid. "I'm sorry, Rowan." She cleared her throat, her focus returning. This just went from a recovery mission to a potential crime scene. She sealed the box in an evidence bag, her movements swift and practiced. The past was now a piece of evidence, subject to procedure and protocol. It felt like a violation. The next morning, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the ranger station. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped out, his shoes immaculate despite the gravel parking lot. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. He introduced himself as Mr. Davies, a representative from the Pioneer Stewardship Group. His smile was polished, his handshake firm but not aggressive. It was a practiced performance of empathy. "We heard about the unfortunate discovery on the mountain," Davies said, his tone one of deep, manufactured concern. "Pioneer Stewardship manages a significant portion of the adjacent private lands, and we consider ourselves partners with the Forest Service in preserving the natural beauty of this region. We'd like to offer our resources to assist with the cleanup." Maya stood beside Rowan, her arms crossed, her expression neutral. "That's very generous, Mr. Davies, but this is an active investigation. The site is under federal jurisdiction." Of course," Davies said, his smile never faltering. "We wouldn't dream of interfering. We simply want to help. An old wreck like that can leach chemicals into the soil, heavy metals, fuel residue. It's an environmental hazard. The longer it sits there, the greater the potential for liability. For everyone." The words were an offer of help, but the undertone was a threat. Clean, polite, and utterly chilling. Rowan stood in silence, the leash for Sergeant wrapped around his hand. The dog, who had been sitting calmly by his side, went rigid. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a vibration that traveled up the leash and into Rowan's arm. It was a sound of pure, controlled warning. Davies didn't seem to notice, but Maya's eyes flickered down to the dog for a second. "Our team is certified in hazardous material containment and removal," Davies continued, his voice smooth as oil. "We could have the site cleared and remediated within 48 hours, quietly, discreetly. It would save the Forest Service a great deal of time and expense." He was offering to erase the evidence, to sanitize the history that was buried on that mountain. "The NTSB will need to conduct their investigation first," Maya said, her voice firm. "Nothing gets moved until they sign off." Davies' smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. "Naturally, but bureaucracy can be so slow. And in the meantime, the story gets out. Unfortunate accidents can attract the wrong kind of attention, damage a community's reputation for pristine wilderness. It would be a shame for this beautiful place to become known for a tragedy." He was talking about the town, but he was looking at Rowan. He was talking about legacies, about what gets buried and what gets remembered. Rowan felt a cold certainty settle over him. This wasn't about a plane crash. Elias hadn't simply gotten lost. He had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. The wreck wasn't an accident. It was a loose end, and Davies was here to tie it up. The dog's growl subsided, but his body remained tense, a coiled spring of suspicion. He knew this man was a threat, a different kind of predator from the ones that roamed the forest. This one wore a suit and carried a smile like a concealed weapon. The stakes had just been raised. This was no longer about the past. It was about what was still happening, right now, under the cover of corporate goodwill and polite, empty words. The system worked exactly as it was designed to. The next day, the box, Elias Vance's final testament, disappeared from the evidence locker at the ranger station. There were no signs of forced entry. The logbook showed it had been properly checked in, and then it was simply gone. An internal investigation was launched, a quiet, bureaucratic process designed to absorb momentum and obscure truth. Maya was placed on administrative leave. Pending the inquiry, her supervisor had told her, his eyes refusing to meet hers. It was a clean, professional removal. She was discredited without a single accusation being made. She called Rowan, her voice tight with a frustration she couldn't show her superiors. "They're burying it, Rowan. Someone made a call, and now everyone is looking the other way." Rowan was visited by a county sheriff's deputy, a young man with a nervous tic and an apologetic air. He was, unofficially, advised to stay away from the crash site. "It's a federal scene now, sir," the deputy had said, staring at a point just over Rowan's shoulder. "For your own safety." It wasn't a request. It was an order wrapped in the language of concern. He had been effectively isolated, cut off from the investigation he had started. The institutional pressure had been applied, and the walls were closing in. The setback was a physical blow. It sent him reeling back into the familiar, suffocating darkness of his own guilt. He had failed again. He had found Elias's final words, and he had lost them. He had let the man down, first in the dust of Kandahar, and now in the cold soil of this mountain that was supposed to be his refuge. The wound from his past, the one he had tried to outrun by moving to the most isolated place he could find, tore open. He retreated into a harsh, bitter silence. The cabin, usually a place of quiet order, became a cage. He sat for hours in the dark, the ghosts of his failures whispering from the corners of the room. The smell of rust was in the water from the tap. The sound of the wind was the sound of an incoming mortar. The past wasn't just a memory, it was an occupying force. Ben came by that evening. He didn't knock, just walked onto the porch and set down a paper bag that smelled of hot stew and fresh bread. "Thought you might not have gotten around to dinner," he said through the screen door. "I'm fine," Rowan bit out, his voice a harsh rasp. "Leave it." "Rowan, I said leave it," he repeated, turning away from the door, away from the quiet concern in his friend's eyes. "I don't need anything." He was pushing him away, pushing away the one person who had consistently shown up without asking for anything in return. He was building his walls higher, reinforcing the perimeter of his isolation. He heard Ben hesitate, a moment of silence that stretched for an eternity. Then, the soft sound of his footsteps retreating down the wooden steps. Rowan didn't look back. He just stood in the deepening gloom, the weight of his own anger a crushing presence. He was alone. He had made sure of it. He sank into his chair, the silence of the cabin pressing in on him. This was what he deserved. This was the penance for his failure. To be the one left behind, the one who stayed when everyone else was gone. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the tide of self-recrimination. He had failed Elias. He had failed Maya. He had failed himself. Then he felt it, a solid, warm weight against his leg, a wet nose pressing into his clenched fist. He opened his eyes. Sargent was there. The dog hadn't moved when Ben had left. He hadn't reacted to Rowan's anger, hadn't flinched at the harshness in his voice. He had simply waited. And now, in the depths of Rowan's collapse, he moved closer. He laid his heavy head on Rowan's knee, his dark eyes looking up, not with pity, but with a steady, unwavering presence. The dog stayed. He did not demand. He did not judge. He simply was. Present. Patient. Unshakable. A living, breathing testament to a loyalty that Rowan felt he had never earned. Sargent had lost Elias, too. He had every right to be lost in his own grief. But instead, he was here, grounding Rowan in the present, pulling him back from the edge. The dog's quiet, persistent presence was a force more powerful than the ghosts that haunted the cabin. It was a silent rebuke to Rowan's despair, a reminder that he was not, in fact, alone. The warmth from the dog's body seeped into him, a small point of heat against the encroaching cold of his guilt. It was the emotional turning point. He could surrender to the darkness, or he could honor the loyalty of the creature at his side. He owed him that much. He owed Elias that much. A new resolve began to form in the quiet of the room, forged in the space between a man's failure and a dog's faith. He had to go back. Not for himself, for the man who didn't make it home, and for the dog who had waited so patiently for the truth. If this story speaks to you, if you believe that loyalty can be a light in the darkest of places, please take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the Lord doesn't send a thunderclap. He sends a quiet friend who refuses to leave our side. Under the cover of a moonless night, Rowan moved back toward the mountain. He wore dark clothes, his face smudged with charcoal from the cold fireplace. He moved not like a hiker, but like a shadow. Sargent, a darker shadow at his side. The dog needed no leash, staying close to Rowan's heel, his senses mapping the darkness far better than any human eye could. The air was sharp, crystalline with cold. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, was amplified in the profound silence. They bypassed the official trail, taking a route through the thick woods that Rowan knew from his long patrols. He carried a small pack with water, a headlamp he wouldn't use unless absolutely necessary, and a deep, burning conviction. They had taken the evidence, but they hadn't taken the place itself. The mountain still held its secrets. Elias had been a soldier, a smoke jumper, a man trained in survival and evasion. He would not have left his entire story in one place. He would have planned for this moment. He would have created a contingency. As they neared the crash site, Sargent's behavior shifted. He veered away from the mangled fuselage, his nose to the ground, his tail low and straight. He wasn't tracking, he was following a memory. He led Rowan past the wreck, deeper into a grove of ancient moss-covered firs. The dog stopped at the base of a fallen giant, a tree whose roots had been torn from the earth in a long-ago storm, creating a hollowed-out cavern of dirt and wood. Sargent began to dig, not at the wreck, but at the base of a massive, upturned root ball. His paws worked with the same focused intensity he'd shown at the trailhead, but this time it was urgent. Rowan knelt beside him, using his hands to pull away clumps of damp earth and rocks. His fingers hit something hard. Not wood, not stone, metal. He worked faster, his breath fogging in the cold air. He uncovered a second box, smaller this time, a waterproof Pelican case, the kind used for sensitive electronics. It was wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with heavy-duty tape. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the real evidence, the part Elias had hidden for the one who would know to look deeper. He carried the case back to the relative cover of an outcropping of rock and carefully sliced through the tape. Inside, protected by foam, was another digital recorder, several small notebooks filled with dense, precise handwriting, and a satellite phone. He turned on the recorder. Elias Vance's voice filled the silent night, calm and steady, the voice of a man reporting facts in the face of his own mortality. He recounted the flight, the sudden, inexplicable engine failure. He described surviving the crash, setting up the shelter in the fuselage. But then the story turned. For weeks, he had observed trucks moving through the forest at night, on old, forgotten logging roads. They belonged to pioneer stewardship. He had watched them dump barrels into an abandoned mine shaft, their contents leaking a sickly, chemical sheen into the nearby creek. Elias had documented it all. He had taken water samples, recorded license plates, and logged dates and times in the notebooks. The plane crash hadn't been an accident. His engine had failed flying over the dump site, a victim of what he suspected was some form of electromagnetic interference from whatever they were hiding in that mine. He knew they were aware of his presence. He knew they were hunting him. The first box, the one left at the trailhead, was a decoy, a beacon. It was for Sargent, who he knew would one day lead the right person there. This second box was the truth. It was for the one who stayed. It was for Rowan. "Rowan," Elias's voice said from the recorder, the sound a physical blow. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it. It means they found me. But it also means you came back. I knew you would. I never doubted you, not for a second. What happened back there, that wasn't on you. It was just the cost of the work. You hear me? You did your job. Now do this one. Don't let them bury this." The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavier than the mountain itself. Rowan sat there in the dark, the words washing over him, a pardon he never expected, an absolution he didn't feel he deserved. He carefully packed the case back into his bag. He had the truth. Now he had to get it to people who would listen. He didn't go home. He went to Ben's garage. The lights were on, a warm yellow square against the blackness. Ben was working under an old pickup truck, a single bare bulb illuminating the grease and steel. He slid out when he heard the door open, his face smudged with oil. He saw the look in Rowan's eyes, the case in his hand, and he didn't ask a single question. He just wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Coffee's on." In the small, cluttered office, Rowan laid it all out. He played the recording. Ben listened, his expression hardening as Elias's story unfolded. When it was over, he was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. "Maya," he said when she answered, "you need to get over to my shop, right now. And you need to call that supervisor of yours and tell him you have new evidence from an anonymous source that corroborates your suspicions." While they waited, Ben made another call, and then another. He spoke in low tones, his words simple, direct. He was calling in markers, activating a network of quiet men like himself, veterans and locals who trusted him more than they trusted any official authority. Maya arrived looking tired but determined. She listened to the recording, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is everything." She looked at Rowan, a new respect in her gaze. "You went back." "Sergeant went back," Rowan corrected. "I just followed." By dawn, the community had begun to rally. A half-dozen logging trucks and pickups, driven by men with grim faces and folded arms, were parked across the only access road to the Pioneer Stewardship site, blocking it completely. It was a silent, peaceful, and utterly immovable protest. Ben stood with them, a thermos of coffee in his hand, a quiet commander of a civilian army. Maya, armed with Elias's recordings and journals, had gone straight to the state's attorney general, bypassing the compromised local authorities. The evidence was undeniable. The institutional wall began to crack. That afternoon, as federal investigators in hazmat suits began swarming the mineshaft, Ben found Rowan watching from a ridge overlooking the scene. The valley below was a hive of activity, the quiet corruption brought into the harsh light of day. Ben came and stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, watching the system that Davies had built be dismantled piece by piece. "He knew you'd come," Ben said quietly. "He had more faith in me than I did," Rowan admitted, his voice thick. Ben put a hand on his shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. The same gesture Elias had given him all those years ago. But this felt different. It felt like an anchor. "You stayed, Rowan," Ben said, his voice soft but clear. "When it mattered, you stayed." Rowan looked at his friend, at the man who had shown up with coffee, who had stood with him in silence, who had rallied an army with a few quiet phone calls. He saw the unwavering loyalty in Ben's eyes, the deep well of unspoken history that connected them. And for the first time since he'd come home, Rowan felt the tightness in his chest loosen, just a little. He didn't run. He was still here. That simple act felt like an exhalation, a release of breath he'd been holding for a decade. It was the quietest kind of victory. The aftermath was not a triumphant explosion, but a slow, grinding process. Mr. Davies was indicted, along with several key executives at Pioneer Stewardship. The legal battles would stretch on for years, a war of attrition fought in courtrooms and depositions. The cleanup of the mine and the surrounding watershed would take a decade and cost millions. The world was not transformed overnight. Change was incremental, honest, and imperfect. The machine of greed and corruption had been damaged, but not destroyed. But in the small town nestled in the shadow of the mountain, something had shifted. The quiet protest at the access road had awakened a sense of shared purpose, a communal refusal to look away. People started talking to each other more, watching out for each other. The wound that Pioneer had inflicted on the land had, in its own strange way, brought the community closer together. Rowan did not leave. The urge to run, to find a new perimeter, a new silence to hide in, had faded. It was replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He had found something here he hadn't realized he was looking for, a place not to hide from the world, but to stand his ground in it. He still walked the trails, but his patrols felt different now, less like a vigil, more like a stewardship. He was no longer just a veteran in exile. He was a part of this place. He was the one who stayed. His guilt over Elias's death had not vanished. It was a scar he would always carry. But it no longer defined him. Elias's final words had reframed the memory, not erasing the pain, but transforming it into a legacy. A duty to see, to speak, to act. He was no longer running from the ghost of the man he'd lost. He was carrying forward the mission of the man he remembered. One evening, He sat on his porch as the sun bled out behind the peaks, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and soft gray. The air was clean, the smell of rust and decay replaced by the scent of pine and wood smoke from his own chimney. Ben's truck pulled into the driveway, and he got out, carrying 2 bottles of beer. He sat in the chair next to Rowan's, and they watched the stars emerge, the silence between them comfortable, complete. They didn't need to speak of what had happened. They had lived it together. At their feet, Sargent lay stretched out on the cool wooden planks of the porch. His work, for now, was done. He was not on alert, not scanning the perimeter. His ears were relaxed, his breathing deep and even. He was simply at rest, a creature at peace in his own home. He had fulfilled his final duty to his first handler, and his quiet, unwavering loyalty had saved the man who had become his second. His presence was a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet of the evening. Looking out at the vast, star-dusted darkness, Rowan thought about faith. He had lost his in the crucible of war, believing it to be a casualty of the things he had seen and done. But perhaps he had been looking for it in the wrong places. Maybe faith wasn't a grand, sweeping revelation. Maybe it wasn't about being saved from the darkness. Maybe faith was quieter than that. Maybe it was the choice to get up in the morning and walk the trail one more time. Maybe it was the trust a man puts in his dog. Maybe it was the friend who shows up with coffee, who stands beside you and helps you hold the line. It was the simple, profound, and breathtaking act of staying. My friends, the world will tell you that strength is in moving on, in leaving the past behind. But sometimes the greatest act of faith, the most profound display of courage, is to simply stay. To stand your ground in the place you are planted, to bear witness to the truth, and to guard the memories of those who can no longer speak for themselves. The Lord does not always call us to a new land. Sometimes He calls us to remain, to be a quiet testament of loyalty in a world that too often runs away. May God bless you and protect you. May He give you the strength to stand firm when you are tempted to flee, and the grace to be a safe harbor for those who are lost. And may you always have a loyal friend by your side, reminding you that you are never truly alone. Sometimes, the deepest roots grow in the places where we were broken.